unfortunately tonight, ladies and gentlemen, you will not have to put up with my appalling impression of Noel Coward. You know, I've not yet had a very dry martini, and that's as much of that as you're going to get, because I don't intend to desecrate the memory of the great man. So as you can see from the title of this talk, I think I was better off in the trenches. Noël Coward, the Great War and Veteran Mentality. For any of you who know Noël Coward's work, you've probably guessed correctly that a lot of my talk tonight is going to concentrate on this happy breed, but I'm also having the odd side glance towards Cavalcade as well. But we can talk more widely about Coward and the Great War if you wish in the questions. And what I really want to explore here is that amazing mystery, really, of the way Coward, a man who did serve, we can get around to that in a bit, but for a very short length of time. But how did he manage to get himself so deeply into the veteran mentality? How did he reflect it, particularly in his play This Happy Breed, which had a very successful film version in 1944? And what particular elements of veteran life did he pick up upon, and veteran culture did he decide to foreground, particularly in This Happy Breed? And we'll look at the extraordinary job that he did, which I think in many ways also reflects the sheer ubiquity of the Great War veteran in British life in the 20s and 30s. So I think, first of all, though, the very first thing we have to establish is Coward as a man obsessed with Britishness and Englishness. Now, he is a man of his time insofar as he will often elide Englishness with Britishness. Occasionally he will, like other commentators, make the distinction that Britishness and Englishness are slightly different things, but a lot of the time there is an elision of the two. And I think this is really important to his understanding of the veteran, is the relationship it has with his own view on Britain, on the British Empire, on recent British history, and his own sense of patriotism. And it starts with that obsession he has that the British are a people with what he will often refer to as horse sense. And by that, he means an instinctive understanding of problems or issues or aspects of life, a sense that is born out of shall we say empiricism rather than theoretical positions. So it's a nation that observes, looks at what's happened, reflects upon it, and then lets that shape its worldview, its view of matters great and small. And as you can see there, there is an amazing deep patriotism to him. What I love about my country is really quite simple. I love its basic integrity, and integrity formed over hundreds of years by indigenous humour, courage, and common sense. So it's not highfalutin ideals, it's not a grand and philosophically developed constitution. It's this idea of innate sense of things. I did love England and all it stood for. I loved its follies and its apathies and curious streaks of genius. I love British courage, British humour, and British understatement. I belong to the exasperating, weather-sodden little island with its uninspired cooking, its muddled thinking, and its unregenerate pride. And it belonged to me whether I liked it or not. And of course, there is also, as you've seen, there is a fabulous patriotism there, because he's not saying that it's all brilliant. In fact, he's saying he loves it entirely because of its flaws, and that the flaws need to be celebrated as well. And it's certainly not perfect. And so he has, I think that stops his patriotism from becoming a prejudicial expression, because we're also talking about a man who was a true patriot. It meant that he also loved a lot of other nations and their cultures as well, being particularly sympathetic to France. And the fascinating thing about this Englishness, Britishness, this sense of patriotism that is so strong, I think, in the 20s and 30s and goes through the Second World War, is how you can see it reflected also in different parts of the British political spectrum, because as I'm sure a lot of you have done, have read, say, something like George Orwell's essay, The Lion and the Unicorn, and you will see a very similar sense of Britishness, coming from someone who's much further to the left than Coward. Or you can go for something kind of centre leftish. If you were to read E.M. Forster, his notes on national character from his wonderful collection of essays, The Abinger Harvest, there's someone who is liberal with a very much with a large L, and a small L, and his understanding of what Englishness, Britishness is also very similar. And I think this is something, though, this kind of base sense of what it is to be English and British is going to run through his perception of what it was to be a veteran in the aftermath of the Great War. So he gets that. Now, the next thing that I think we have to say about where he places the veteran, he very firmly understands, as we see in this Happy Breed, that the volunteer army that went to war, massively on the Somme in 1916, that one that was in training through 1915, was heavily one that reflected middle class life in Britain, that it had a deep middle class culture and feel to it. Yes, of course, there were lots of men from the working class in it, but as we know from PALS battalions that go under the name of things like the Hull Commercials or the Sheffield City Battalion, there is something of bourgeois refinery about it, a sense of middle class mores and views of the world, and that's very much reflected in this Happy Breed, and where he pitches the class of the two families in that, and the two men who are going to be like the voice piece of the voice box of veteran opinion. And I just give you, I put the examples of this Happy Breed there on the left. That's how the film and indeed the play starts, with the idea that Frank Gibbons, freshly demobilised, has got a job in a tourist agency on Oxford Street that's offering tours of the battlefields. So what could be more middle class in reflection than the idea, of a man who gets a job in a white collar, desk bound occupation, that of a travel agency, selling tours to other white collar workers, suburban workers who want to see either where they fought or family members fought, and putting it there against that essential text of middle class war reflection, R.H. Mottram's the Spanish Farm trilogy, and you can see there from that chapter extract, they were drawn from the two mainstreams of English middle class life. For the public school men and military age were either in or as near as they could get to the regular army, and the manual worker, however skilled, seldom rose to be an officer. So he's looking at it from the point of view of the men who were given commissions. But nonetheless, there's that sense, therefore, in English culture in the 20s and 30s, that the soul of the new army was reflected in middle class backgrounds, and Coward picked up on that. He knew that, he had that instinctively, and brought that to the fore in this Happy Breed. So what else do we get? If it starts with we're building up a picture that starts with a middle class perspective, where does that take us? What other signs and symbols of what the veteran will find important are we going to see here? Well, the first thing, and you'll see all the stills that I take are from the 1944 David Lean film version. The whole play, the whole film starts off, with a Great War veteran moment. It is Peace Day. It's 19th of July, 1919. they get that point that the cenotaph is at the heart of British life, that that the nation has come out to salute its army and to salute its war dead. And I said that the cenotaph is something that's burned into the soul of British people. And rather brilliantly, you can see Lean and Coward and the whole production company's sense of authenticity when they shot this recreation, that they made sure that they recreated a plaster and wood cenotaph, which is much more angular than the real thing, which will be carved on the intarsis principle out of Portland stone. So they do a good job there. And straight away in that scene we get the regret of the veteran. Frank and Bob, the two veterans, Bob's taken his wife Ethel, and they are climbing up on the lampposts, as you can see, in order to make sure they can see the march past. And Bob says, straight away to Frank, "Core, don't it make you wish that you hadn't been demobbed?" That pride and that regret, that they're not still in khaki, no matter what they've been through. No matter what they've seen on the Western Front, there is still a sense in pride in what they've done, pride in the family that they joined in the army, pride in the cause that they had fought for. And yes, they've become civilians and they're back with their loved ones, but on this day of all days, they regret not being back in. They regret not being able to march along. So I think that sense of the innate pride of the veteran, and straight away that complexity that they have about their war service. I said that these are two guys that have seen and done a lot, and yet they still wished they were part of it. Now, the next thing, of course, that Coward picks up on is a sense of the crucial element of regimental pride, that ex-servicemen are not simply ex-servicemen of the British Army, they are ex-servicemen of a corps or a regiment. And the visuality, the ability to do this on a slightly grander scale through the film version, I think really pays off here, where Lean's camera picks out a soldier of the Buffs. The Buffs are crucial to Coward's understanding of the war. Remember, this is a man who lives in Kent by this stage, has got a lot of friends across Kent, does a lot of travelling across the county, and clearly, even if he wasn't aware of it before, must have picked up on the importance of the East and West Kent regiments and what that meant to the society in which he lived, and the people with whom, the milieu in which he would have moved when he was in residence in Goldenhurst in Kent. So the Buffs foregrounded, and indeed that's what we get in Frank and Bob, their discussion of their precise regiments, which I'll come down to in a moment. And we get these bonds of common service and experience. So I say that the play starts in, and the film starts in 1919, and we have this extraordinary, a very British Dickensian coincidence that two old pals who've been separated by the war find out that they are next door neighbours, Frank and Bob bump into each other on the day that Frank moves in with his wife and family. So you get this moment of recognition. Frank Mitchell, Bob Mitchell, that's right. Don't you remember me, Frank Gibbons, the Buffs, B Company, Festival at 1915? My God, it's old Gibbo. I thought you were as dead as mutton after that night attack when we'd got up to Gavinci and left your lot in the mud. Me, dead as mutton? I'm tougher than that. Only one small hole through me leg in 4 years. How did you make out? Not bad. Got gassed in 1917, but I'm all right now. Made me chest a bit weak, that's all. Straight away, in just a few lines, I think Coward captured that both that kind of terseness, but the way in which veterans spoke in, shall we say, iceberg language. They chucked a few things around. This is the understatement as well of the British, a few little points, but underneath that, the meanings that are there. You know, I thought you were as dead as mutton after that night attack when we'd gone up to Givenchy and left your lot in the mud. You know, all of the associations that the veteran imagination, the veteran memory could pull up are all there, and I think must have meant so much also to the veteran audience watching and consuming this play and this film. And then straight away, you know, that sense of common service, common experience builds a bond between these men, which can and will never be broken. It is something that they are carrying on into their civilian lives and will therefore as well naturally set them apart from all others. None who had donned khaki, none who had who had not been near an active theatre of war was ever going to get close to this private world. And I think it's amazing that Coward captures it so well. And then the other thing, you know, that he gets so brilliantly, because we get a very big scene, an extended scene, a crucial one, actually, kind of about nearly halfway through the play, which is set on the night of a regimental reunion, a Buffs regimental reunion, where both of them come back, as you can see from those stills, pretty much half cut and start chatting about the world, you know, chewing the fat together, about the condition of the old guys that they'd seen. You know, how some look a bit down on their luck, some are obviously not properly employed, but by the same token, there is also that sense of it being a night of magic for the two of them. You know, they've reconnected with old pals. They have told all the old stories. They have relived everything together in this evening. They've got the medals on, Pipsqueak and Wilfrid, you know, and Frank makes a joke about when he sprays, because he's half cut, you know, and he sprays his soda siphon onto his medals, and he says, "Oh, now I've wetted me Victoria Cross," and all of that kind of knockabout humour. So that sense of service in the war being the best of times, the worst of times. Again, I think Coward nails brilliantly, and you know, you see it there. You can hopefully see that little extract from a Buffs regimental reunion from the Dragon, the Buffs magazine, which has this spirit completely. The health of our guest was then proposed by RQMS Leonard, to which Sir John Capper replied, saying how much he appreciated the knowledge of the esteem in which he was held by all ranks of the 8th Battalion, the Buffs. You know, these moments that bond officers and men together, the bond, therefore, as Coward is saying, as someone conservative with the small c, you know, the army, like the navy, reflects the nation in microcosm. It is a family, it has ranks, it has a ladder of those at the top and those at the bottom. It never means that those at the top are unaware of those at the bottom. Well, at least it shouldn't do. That's what a family is all about. But you know, sometimes you know where you are on that ladder, and you put your faith and your trust in those who are above you on it to do the right by you, and vice versa. So in every way, it was a grand evening, and we want to see more members of the old 8th Battalion next year. We promise them that they will not regret having made the journey if they will only make the effort. And you know, that extract from the Dragon is essentially what Coward turns in to play and screenplay dialogue in this Happy Breed. And as you've guessed as well, where this is all coming from in many ways is a common cultural source that's in total ubiquitous parlance in 20s and 30s Britain, which is that it's the world of the Wipers times, but more particularly perhaps of Bert, Alf and the Better Ole. This is Ben's fatherism at work. You know, the idea of the soldier who gets on with his duty. He might not always want to do it, but ultimately he will, you know, and he's certainly not daft enough to jump up and down and say the whole time, me, me, me. I would like to volunteer, you know, for Operation Certain Death. But when the moment comes, he is absolutely dependable and gets on with it. But he also, the rest of the time, is going to be slightly facetious about this, is going to be joking, is going to be full of understatement. I mean, you know, so it's a chronic condition of understatement that Bert, Alf, and the world of the better all have, and that world which you know, soldiers had bought into and had valued so much in the Bairnsfather cartoons, in the better old play. Again, Coward has got enough sense of British culture, has got his finger on the pulse enough, is enough of an observer to pick up on it all and meld it so beautifully into this happy breed. And so to sort of show that again, here it is, you know, what you essentially see in this happy breed is exactly this, that the camaraderie, the regimental pride, and the spirit of the trenches is rebuilt and is shown in that play and in that film. And there it gives you that whole thing that you've just seen. You know, look at the drinks, look at the Johnny Walker being poured out. You know, they live for Johnny Walker Red Label. And here another extract from a Buffs reunion dinner. Is Dusty Miller a collector of antique whiskey glasses? And did he arrive home with a whiskey glass in his pocket after the Buffs dinner? How long had Dusty been training in the kick step, as he did it very smartly going up towards Piccadilly after the dinner? Who was the woman hater who blew kisses to the canteen girl? Who was the long and short of it at the Eastern dance? And did the short of it enjoy her taxi ride with the two Johns one night? So all of this kind of tongue-in-cheek, slightly Donald McGill postcard kind of stuff is all there, and there you're seeing it. The whiskey glasses, the soda siphon, this wonderful British paradox that the essentially military is at exactly the same time the essentially unmilitary. What shows the real soldier is often, you know, his ability to slough off the real soldier, you know, and not be the kind of Buckingham Palace guardsman postcard version of it. But this is the reality of it here in their lives, in the way they view the world, the way they view each other and their families. Now, I think what Coward must have known about, given his status in the theatrical world, given his knowledge, his increasing knowledge of cinema as well, what he sees, those that he mixes with, is the huge success of the Bairnsfather play version of the life of Bert and Alf, the better old, with its original production in 1917 and the film versions of 1918, you know, 1926, and various other spin-offs. Now, you know, whereas Bert and Alf are to a certain extent caricatures and, you know, are very much musical characters, Coward is a more skilled playwright than that. The genius of Frank and Bob in this happy breed is that they are well-rounded characters. Every line they have, you know, there's an authority to it, there's a believability to it. But I think he's obviously got these ideas in mind, and this is also helping him in his understanding of military life, of the view of the soldier and what their experiences are and were like, and crucially the sense of the army and the regiment as home, you know, and here we see it, that the regimental home, you know, so once again juxtaposing a still from the film with the reality of what a Buffs reunion night looked like in the 20s and 30s. Coward is presenting us with a real slice of British life of this period, and I think to sort of repeat it ad nauseum, I think he does it absolutely brilliantly, and that whole sense that of the best of times, of the worst of times, that the reunion dinners are their moment to remind themselves of what they've been through, remind themselves that comradeship is everything. As it says there, the dinner was the means of bringing together again men who had served in the war and who had formed intimacies and friendships that should never be forgotten. When they went through those long vigilances in the trenches, they got to know one another better than they would ever do during long years of peace. In the sudden attack at night or in the rush before the light of day, officers and men were thrown together and saw the gallantry and initiative of those with whom they fought. So you can see as well, that in the knockabout, in the pleasantries, there is also a core of robust messaging that goes on, and I think Coward, that robust messaging, is something that Coward absolutely subscribes to. That the war had been a test of national character, and that the British as a family had come through it unbelievably well, entirely because it is full of men like Frank and Bob, and so they have every right to kind of wallow in those days when they want to, and that their voices need to be listened to, that they have the right to speak. And and again, sorry to sort of keep stressing this link with the reality of things like the Buffs Past and Present Association, but this is exactly the kind of world that Frank and Bob are supposed to be part of and are comfortable with. Something like this Veterans Parade in Canterbury in 1929, and it will plough all the way through the Second World War, even going on up to the 60s. You can imagine a much older Frank and Bob sitting amongst that lot with their medals, with their Pipsqueak and Wilfred, still recounting the good old days, and doing that thing that Siegfried Sassoon in what is it, in To One Who Was With Me in the Great War, in remembering we forget much, that crucial thing, in remembering we forget much that was monstrous, and that's what helps them, of course, mentally, I think, to survive it. Now, what he's also picking up on here, I think what Coward nails and understands so well is that sense of when veterans don't speak, of when ex-servicemen don't speak, when they're not saying something, it doesn't mean that they're shying away, or it doesn't mean that they're blocking and boxing up, what they did, what they went through, and just putting it on a shelf and never approaching it spiritually at all. That they just want to disappear back in to the anonymity of ordinary civilian life. It's more that they are men who choose the place and the space in which they are going to talk, in which they are going to let things out. And Coward, it gets that, say, by placing the night of the regimental reunion, by making that so crucial in the play. I think he's understood that, and it's exactly that thing, that you can pick up, that you see in Charles Carrington, Soldier from the Wars, returning. There he is, coming very much from the officer class, the officer background. For some years, I was one of a group of friends who met every Armistice Day at the Café Royal for the end of a party, until we began to find ourselves out of key with the new age. Imperceptibly, the feast day became a fast day, and one could hardly go brawling on the Sabbath. The do-gooders captured the armistice, and the British Legion seemed to make its principal outing a mourning. To march on the cenotaph was too much like attending one's own funeral, and I know many old soldiers who found it increasingly discomforting year by year. We preferred our reunions in private, with no pacifist propaganda. So he takes it perhaps one stage further than Frank and Bob would have done, but it makes exactly that same point. So Frank and Bob were proud of their war service. They're proud there on Peace Day. They are proud on the night of their regimental reunion. They like wearing their medals. They like gathering, and clearly, though, it's in that gathering together where they are most loquacious about it. They're comfortable with each other in their little houses in South London, just over the other side of the river. They will chat to each other over the garden fence. They will indulge then, but not everybody is going to be allowed into the innermost sanctum of this world, because it is one that is defined by experience. And it is, to go back to where I kind of started from, that the kind of passwords are those simple introductory statements. I thought you was dead as mutton that night, and how you respond to that opens up the pathway to the past. Is almost like the Masonic handshake that brings you into the fellowship, and then they're at one with each other and they're comfortable with each other. But say not by no means everybody is going to be treated to that or allowed into that. Here is where it sort of sneaks out, where once again they're half cut. It's on the night that the general strike collapses, and Frank and Bob have been out helping the British Legion with the organisation for the maintenance of supplies. And because it's another night of victory, the strike has been called off, and that's the cause that they have supported, is that of Baldwin's approach to the strike. And Ethel, the role played by Celia Johnson, she says to them both, "You've come through a few public houses too, or I'm no judge." "Well, there's no denying it, Mrs. G. We had a couple at the Plough with Captain Birchall, who brought us all the way from Baker Street in his car, and then just one next door with me." And then Phyllis, who's going to be Frank and Ethel's soon-to-be daughter-in-law. "Mr. Gibbons and Mr. Mitchell were in the war together, weren't they?" "Yes, and to hear them talk, you'd think they were the only ones that was." So there it is, isn't it? That when they're together, they don't stop nagging about it. They've always got something to say about it, or they're always going to bring back the contemporary, what's going on today, great or small. They will connect it some way with their war experience, and that's their lingua franca. That's when both of them understand. Now, clearly, Ethel has picked up on that, so they don't hide it from her completely. But as her response shows, yes, and to hear them talk, you'd think they were the only ones that was. They talk to each other in a bubble about it, and I kind of walk round them. I go round them. I might bring them a cup of tea, and they are nagging together, and they're in that world. They are in that space, and I don't exist then. He has to flick out of the reverie. He comes back to us and the family life. But when they are together, you'd think they were the only two that was. So, so much for the idea of, of veteran silence. The veteran silence exists only in relation to the choices they make as to who is going to be exposed, who is going to be allowed in to the bistry, into the fraternity. And again, I know I keep saying this ad nauseam, that the genius of Coward's approach to all of this understanding is that he gets under the skin of that, I think, so well, that he picks up. His powers of an observer are really quite wonderful. And as I mentioned, because of his sense of his deep, great sense of patriotism, he is seeing he sees the armed forces as a microcosm of the best bits of the nation, and therefore the ex-serviceman is the soul of the nation, and the ex-serviceman represents horse sense. It's there. It was there in them as their birthright, and then the experiences on the Western Front or wherever they served sharpen that, mold it even more, make it an even more prominent part of their world view. And as you can see, it's essentially a conservative one with a small c, conservative with a small c, not necessarily conservative with a large c, and it's deeply organicist, it's deeply evolutionary, and therefore as well it's deeply antithetical to theoretical or philosophical concepts, being based upon a horse sense, being based upon something that's in the soul, being something that's instinctive rather than kind of drummed in through lessons. There it is. They're talking about their soon-to-be son-in-law, who's at this stage in his life is a little bit of a political radical. He's deeply of the left. He's flirting with the Communist Party. He wants to lead revolution. And on Christmas Day, Frank and Ethel sneak away into their kitchen for a quiet little moment by themselves while all the family parties are going on sort of in the other room. And Ethel's a little bit worried about what their future son-in-law might be like. And here's Frank's response, the ultimate response of the man who has seen and done a lot. It is the phlegmatism of a man who has seen and done a lot, who is not roused to great fits of temper or emotion quickly or easily, and is prepared to be reflective. There's something to be said for it. There's always something to be said for everything. So there it is, right? Something to be said for everything. It's the understanding of the British way of doing things that he has the questions about. Where they go wrong is trying to get things done too quickly. We don't like doing things quickly in this country. It's like gardening. Someone once said we was a nation of gardeners, and they weren't far wrong. We're used to planting things and watching them grow and looking out for changes in the weather. What works in other countries won't work in this one. We've got our own way of settling things. It may be a bit slow and it may be a bit dull, but it suits us all right, and it always will. That's a remarkably powerful speech, it strikes me, but particularly for a nation that had gone through so much in the 20s and 30s, as a direct result of the war. And then as the 30s goes by, this is a play that's written in the spring of 1939, is in rehearsal in the late summer of 1939, and then will not reach the stage because of the outbreak of war. It will not reach the stage until April 1943. So when Coward's writing this, the way he's looking back on 20 years of British history, and then putting the veteran as the soul of it, and he doesn't make him a kind of angry middle-aged man. He doesn't make him a ranting middle-aged man. He makes him a reflective, calm one. Now we'll see there are some flashes of temper in Frank. We'll look at one in a moment and what brings him there. But this sense that the British are like gardeners, calm, organic, quiet, like thinking of the longer view, like thinking of the changes of the seasons, and crucially are different to other countries. Now, that doesn't mean, I say, what I think is the glory of this doesn't mean that Frank or Bob are in any way xenophobes. They are the true thing. They are patriots, but not the xenophobes. For those of you that know the play, for those of you that know the film version, one of the things that they both rejoice in singing on that Peace Day is the Madelon, as the French contingent marches past. And Bob says, it took me 4 years to learn the words to this song, and he joins in with the Madelon. That this is a sense of people that are insular but not cut off. They are an island race, but that doesn't mean that they can't appreciate the world around them and try to understand it. So it's a very complicated and fascinating world that we've got here. Now, so to come on to the British Legion and the way this happy breed deals with the general strike and the veteran stance on it. As I'm sure you all know, the British Legion chucks its weight behind the organisation for the maintenance of supply. And I think for a lot of the old boys, it did feel like the Great War Mark II. Now, of course, there's also a lot of regret in a lot of them that they see it as possibly a low-level version of a civil war as well. And some of their old comrades from the trenches, they might be on opposing sides, which is what makes Frank's point about there is something to be said for everything all the more important. You might take one side, but that doesn't mean that you can't ultimately be understanding or a person of compromise. And I think that's really important as well, as sort of setting up the veteran as the soul of the nation. It doesn't mean ostracizing, cutting people off forever. And we get, though, this sense of the British Legion as strike breakers, but essentially strike breakers in an old bill and and Alf kind of a way. So the strike is presented as pretty much, almost knockabout humor, with Frank and Bob becoming an omnibus team, Frank driving and Bob as conductor, making all sorts of chirpy comments as commuters are getting on and off, and doing their bit all over again. Now, as we see there, they're being socially, and in some ways politically conservative. They've gone for the status quo. They've gone in support of the government. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they are conservative with a capital C all the way through to their soul. It's on this issue they happen to believe that the right thing to do is to support the government and to maintain the stability of the nation. And that's the crucial thing, that Coward will put into the mouth of the veteran. And because there are so many of them doing their bit for the British Legion, we know that is a sentiment that a lot of them share. So the general strike, that night when it breaks down, Frank's son, Reg, has gone off with his pal, who's the left winger, and they are literally the other side of the barricade. They get involved in a punch up. Reg gets involved in a punch up on the Whitechapel Road, and as you can see, he gets hit by a brick that on the head that gives him a nasty cut. And his mum is really terrified as to what might have happened to him. And this is the way Frank puts him right that evening on the night the strike breaks down. And this, again, an absolutely fascinating speech here. The way he presents himself to him. He doesn't bite his son's head off, but he comes at it entirely from the point of view of his war service. It's the lens through which everything in his life is seen. It's this, son. I belong to a generation of men, most of which aren't here anymore. And we all did the same thing for the same reason, no matter what we thought about politics. Now that's all over, and we're all going on as best we can as though nothing had happened. But as a matter of fact, several things did happen. And one of them was this country suddenly got tired. It's tired now, but the old girl's got stamina, and don't you make any mistake about it. And it's up to us ordinary people to keep things steady. Now, in a world, that had tipped over to political extremes, fascism on the continent, communism, as in USSR, in a world that had gone for political extremes, here is the veteran of the man of common sense, the man who can see some validity in some arguments and that certain things might need to be done, but says nothing is worth it if it overturns the basic stability of the country, and if it overturns that stability in such a way as to bring more misery than the things that it will actually put right, the problems that it will actually solve. And you'll notice as well that way in which, and this is the language as well of Armistice Day in its own way, Frank's speech here, the way the war is taken as if it was an apolitical act, as if it had nothing to do with politics, that it was as simple as if, how do I put this? As if there was a simple moral issue that one side had acted aggressively and it invaded its neighbours, which somehow took it outside of politics and made it almost like a purely moral issue, contained in its own box. So it didn't matter what political stance you had, all could see that was a bad thing, that was a wrong thing that needed righting, and that's what he'd done. We all did the same thing for the same reason, no matter what we thought about politics. What you might say, no matter what we thought about domestic politics, there was something bigger on the horizon that needed sorting out, and we did it. But the experience of doing that made the country tired. So what the veteran can do, and what the veteran is calling upon the rest of society to do, is to show its stamina and to show its stability. In some ways, this is also what you're going to see for those of you who know your Second World War propaganda films. Say something like "A London Can Take It." The incredible script of that. What is it that he says? The sign of a great fighter in the ring is, can he get up after the fall? And he says, like London, and Britain does that every morning after every blitz. It gets back up and it just stands there ready, for another round of it. And then there's, I think, a very similar thing here, that the veteran is the kind of core repository of that stability and that stamina. And obviously that was going to be something that we played upon in the Home Guard as well when it came to veteran presence in it. So here we go. Conservatives, but not necessarily conservatives. The national government and appeasement. This is one of the very few moments in the play where Frank gets angry. He gets angry with his sister, who is essentially she's become an unconditional pacifist by the late 30s, and he is deeply worried, Frank, about the policy of appeasement, and is appalled by the Munich Agreement. And sort of comes back home and said, I've seen all the crowd, cheering their heads off, and they don't know why they're cheering. I think they're cheering just because they were scared. And Sylvia says to him that she thinks he's a warmonger, all this sense of, why do we have to face off someone? Why do we have to put them in their place? She says, I'm a woman, I don't care who we appease. And she says, just because you enjoyed yourself in the last war. And that's what gets him. That's what sparks him off. Enjoyed yourself. And in some ways, you have to feel sorry for Sylvia. The way he talks, you could be forgiven for thinking that he had enjoyed himself. But I think that is where Coward shows us, shall we say, the outer limits of understanding of the veteran's private world. Because he will talk so enthusiastically, because he will talk to Bob so garrulously about their war service, and they reflect upon it on that best of times, worst of times way, the outsider will not get the depth of shading there, the subtlety of what they're saying, and perhaps could be forgiven for thinking that it was a straightforward, simplistic enjoyment of it, partly perhaps with the implication because they are unthinking savages who just like inflicting violence. And it's clearly that bridles with Frank, and say for a very rare moment, he's up on his feet and he's barking. Now, listen here, Sylvia, don't you talk to me like that, because I won't have it. See, I did not enjoy myself in the last war. Nobody but a bloody fool without any imagination would ever say that he did. But then he comes to his point. It's back to this point. You reach a point in life, you reach a point in the lives of nations where something happens where decent people have to say enough is enough and do their bit to stop that, regardless of whatever other differences they might have had amongst themselves. It's the kind of the subtlety of that point. So Frank and Bob may be typical lower middle class Londoners, but Coward, really tells us in this play, don't go patronizing them, because they are sophisticated, deep, intelligent men in their own way. Their language, they may drop their H's and everything else, and they may not act like officers, and they may have a deep respect for that class hierarchy, but they're not fools. And as he says, nobody but a bloody fool without any imagination would ever say that he did. And I think that's a really powerful part of the play. Now, let joy be unconfined, people, as I'm moving towards the conclusion. The thing that's fascinating here, that's balancing out the veteran's voice, that I think is really important in all of this, is the strength of the woman's voice, the veteran's wife, the ex-serviceman's wife, the women around the ex-serviceman. And again, the fact that Coward, as we know, you might say in his own way, kind of part of a dramatic apostolic tradition, which perhaps you could argue hands on that family silver to people like Alan Bennett and perhaps Victoria Wood as well in their own way. These acute observers of class and place and location in British life, but also that acute observation of the relationship between the sexes, between genders. So Ethel is a remarkable character, a fascinating character, his wife, and the poignancy of how she kind of throws her little dart into the veterans' bubble, and the effect they have on Frank, and a lot of the time, as you can see, that he tries to play that the bluff, cheery guy, but it's set against the anguish that's been in Ethel's soul throughout the war, and that she can pick up on again just by thinking about it. They've just moved in, to their new house soon after Peace Day. I just can't get over not having that awful weight on my mind the whole time. How do you mean? Oh, what, me perishing on the field of slaughter? What a chance. There was a chance every minute of every day for 4 years, and don't you forget it. I used to feel sick every time the postman came, every time the bell rang. And to have that yin and yang again, I think is what makes this Happy Breed such a powerful play, and the way that Ethel speaks on behalf of so many women, of all women in many ways who've gone through the war. We're lucky it isn't over and done with for some people. Look at poor old Mrs. Worsley, 2 sons gone and her husband, nothing left to live for. And Mrs. Cross, with that boy that she was so proud of, done in for life, can't even feed himself properly. We're lucky, all right. And that's the flip side. That's the other side to the jocularity of Johnny Walker bottles on regimental reunions. The voice of the woman, the woman bystander, but the bystander who had seen into the heart of the horror of war, and was, as I'll come back to this point in a minute, was in her own way, therefore, a veteran of it, an ex-service person in their own, because they've been so tight up against the world of the armed forces and what the war was doing, and the pain of the bereaved woman. Aunt Sil, who's always presented as a bit dopey, a bit scatty, really. But look, the way her life might have been, and this is Ethel discussing Aunt Sil with their daughter Queenie. If it hadn't been for Bertie getting killed, she'd have been all right, I expect. What was he like? Bertie, a bit soppy, I always thought, but still she liked him. How awful to be so dependent on a man living or dying that it could ruin your whole life. I don't think I ever would be. Well, don't be too sure. If your dad had gone, I wouldn't have been the woman I am today. Far from it. So the strength, that wonderful thing that the veterans, the ex-servicemen, might have liked to present themselves as at times, or even thinking and acting that they were entirely enclosed in their own bubble world with their other veterans. But as all of them knew, as Coward points out here, that, shall we say, they run up and down a peninsula. They go to the edge of it, which connects them to the veteran world, and they run back to the mainland where their wives and children are, that they inherit, or perhaps it's like a Venn diagram, that they inhabit different circles, and that occasionally the circles enclose every bit of their life. And that's something that the pain, that the position of the woman in the war, which I think comes out equally strongly in Cavalcade, where the multi roles of women, the one, the Cavalcade, which is the great 1931 precursor of this Happy Breed, but has a multi-class point of view. It looks at life up and from the Boer War until 1929 through the parallel perspectives of an upper class family and the below stairs family that had been their servants. So you get this kind of multi-class perspective, but kind of coming through it, you have these multi-roles of women, particularly when the Boer War and then the South African War and then the Great War break out, and there you see Diana Wynyard as Mrs. Marriott there, seeing her son off at the railway station, and you certainly see her kind of living in the intersection of 3 circles. She is bystander watching the war, but she's also a player in it, having to stand on a railway platform, sending her son off whilst he goes off to war. And that experience, of rubbing shoulders with khaki, of kind of smelling the soot on the railway station, of looking in their eyes as they are going, makes her, I think Coward is saying, a veteran in exactly the same way that the men are. And you see it. I'm sure a lot of you know the play. It looks as if the son Joey is going to marry Fanny, the daughter of their former servant. So there's going to be this cross-class kind of new dynasty, this cross-class new relationship that might emerge after the war. And at the very last minute, in the last knockings of the war, Joey is killed, and there she's receiving the telegram. And I think in some ways her grief, the fact that she has suffered the wound of grief, that is a war wound. I think Coward presents her then as making the step, say, into the ex-service sphere. Women can become veterans. And I think that's a fascinating part of these plays. And then what does she do? Because she has a veteran's mentality, because Mrs. Marriott has that sense, Lady Marriott, as she's going to become, as her husband gets his knighthood. She goes out on Armistice night to take part in the celebrations. Her son has just been killed. He's just been killed. So she summons up every bit of British phlegm and reserve to get out there and to do her duty, which she sees it as to thank God that the war is over and that peace has come, and that her nation, which did stand for right, has been proven right. Right has beaten might, and she dutifully salutes that on Armistice night. She has all the right of the veteran to do it. Right, so here we are. I've spoken about Coward a lot. Let's very quickly, as we wrap up, how does Coward tap into this stream? Well, we might start with perhaps like a kind of little bit of facetiousness, or no, not facetiousness, a little bit of tenuous link. As a man who had at least spent a part of his very young life in Battersea, just over the river, before he went kind of upmarket to upmarket-ish to Chelsea and Ebury Street. He's obviously, as a Londoner, as someone involved in theatrical London, he has got the Great War all around him, and indeed on his old doorstep, on his old stamping ground. There are war memorials everywhere, but there's also one of the most remarkable ones on his old stamping ground, his old place, that the world of the inner suburbs, which he understands so well and presents in This Happy Breed, has got itself this amazing war memorial in Battersea Park. As it says in the Manchester Guardian, it's the real thing. You can see these fellows walking into action all keyed up and knowing what's coming, ready for it, real Tommies they are, and going through it, holding themselves tight and cautious. And that's a veteran reaction to that memorial. So Coward has, a kind of veteran reaction to the war, and reminders of it right on his doorstep, including places that he knew intimately and that had intimately shaped his outlook on life. As for his own war record, as I'm sure a lot of you know, it's really not distinguished at all. He is conscripted into the Artists' Rifles. Absolutely hates it. Seems to have both a mix of a real and imagined, though I don't think there's any distinction between real and imagined here. He believed it was happening to him, and it was happening to him. He essentially has a mental breakdown, and is discharged from the army. There's his medal card, and it's discharged under medical reasons for being unfit for medical service. Now for military service. Now he never disguises that. He talks about that in his autobiographies. He says that he pretty much says, I failed. I couldn't cope with army life. Men were dying all around, and I didn't do it. But obviously, it leaves a mark on him. It leaves a deep mark on him. And I think in things like This Happy Breed and Cavalcade, he is determined to salute those who did do their bit, and to find out and to understand them as much as possible, and present them in a celebratory way as possible, but without making them caricatures and puppets. And I think that is the tribute and the honor that he pays to them. So again, how did he tap then? How did he get into this? Well, he has, as I said, he has the regional knowledge of the Buffs and the East Surreys. Bob is from the East Surreys. Frank is from the Buffs, and they're both very proud of their regiments. You know, as someone who lived in West Kent, who understood that borderland between Kent, Sussex, Surrey, had lots of friends in that area. You know, and he went to parties. You know, did moved around, would have no doubt picked up on the sense of pride in the regiments, in their particular war experiences, where they fought, where they hadn't fought. This is also someone, you know, who was going to be for a short while in Journey's End, but you know, he's going to play an officer in that. Although Frank and Bob, their characters are far more like Trotter in Journey's End, you know, the working class character who's given a wartime emergency commission. But I think probably just immersing himself in Journey's End, and also and Sheriff's play had given him a sense of what military life was like. And he does have a deep friendship with lots of veterans. Now, all of them are coming, you know, from quite an extraordinary position. They're none of them quite, they aren't Franks or Bobs. You know, it's Siegfried Sassoon, it's T.E. Lawrence, it's Percy Wyndham Lewis, Sir Ian Hamilton, Anthony Eden, Geoffrey Amherst. But I'm surmising that particularly from people like Anthony Eden, you know, Anthony Eden, who's becoming well on the pathway to what becomes known as a one nation conservative, you know, who has been shaped in his political outlook by the men that he served with in the trenches, and he has seen the endurance and the reliability of the British working class, you know, and lower middle class, and has kind of thought to himself, these people deserve a better deal, and they deserve our respect. You know, when you think of kind of Edenite conservatism, I'm really wondering whether it's in the conversations with Eden that he's also picking up on stuff that is going to give him such an authentic voice. And then finally, how did Coward tap into this mentality? How did he get it so right? Well, I think also ultimately he dips into himself. And to quote from Oliver Soden's most recent, and if you haven't read it, I strongly recommend you do it. It's a great biography. His the most recent biography of Coward. His was the gaiety of a man who knew grief. Now that's exactly what you see in Frank and Bob. You know, that constant gaiety, that light-heartedness, which is the layer on top of what they have seen, on what they have experienced. That's Coward himself, you know, a man who knew grief, who also knew his pains and sufferings. Admittedly, some of them coming from you know, caused by entirely different things, but there is that similarity. Coward, his was an extravagant array of lives in which he cast himself in different lead roles, a seemingly endless masked ball to which disguise and facade were inherent. And that is surely at times exactly what the veterans do in order to get on with their everyday lives, in order to fit back in. They wear masks, they put up a facade so that some people think that they simply enjoyed the war, rather than it being an immensely complex thing that they're constantly processing, in order to be a decent husband and decent father after what they've been through. They put on disguises and facades. They play roles throughout the rest of their lives. And yeah, I think that is in Coward as well. So for all sorts of different reasons. But by dipping into himself, I think he found something of the veteran mentality as well. So on that note, I will shut up and thank you all very much for listening, and happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Mark. Usual, if you enjoyed that, if you would like to raise your hands. I thought it was amazing, Mark, as always. Thank you. You can probably see on your own screen, Mark, the hands are going up.
Thank you.
Right, we've already had a couple of questions in. The first person I'm bringing up, you kind of touched on his question, but I'll bring him up. This is Andrew Moody. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's referring to In Which We Serve.
In Which We Serve, yeah.
Lost film, a balance to Journey's End, perhaps. Mm-hmm. Given the different circumstances of the two world wars, do you think that Noël Coward could have pulled it off convincingly?
I'm trying to work out in what sense. Pulled. I'm just kind of not gripping what sense, because obviously in Which We Serve, I think Coward's love affair with the Navy, his patriotism, his sense of what Britain is as a nation, as a family spirit, comes through with immense strength and clarity. It is a remarkable film. It's technically a remarkable film. In terms of performances, it's amazing. And of course, he does that thing, doesn't he? In which we serve, just as he's going to, just as he does in Cavalcade and in this Happy Breed, of admitting loss. In which we serve, the ship goes down. Men are drowned, men die. The reality of war, the everyday reality of war, is presented to British people. Now, admittedly, at the end of it, there is hope, because he's, as it says right at the end of that film, the survivors go on to new ships, and Captain Kinross himself gets command of a new ship. The cause is still there, and they're all still committed to it. But what I think is truly remarkable, and which we always say, is the way in which it deals with the nitty-gritty reality of war, and that hideousness in that, that it's not just the service personnel that die, because, as I'm sure people remember, when there's a scene in which the Blitz hits Plymouth, and it kills civilians, old, the old and the young are there, and this looking of the war and all its effects in the eye, I think is a really bold move by Coward, and Lean and the cinematic production team that he has with him. And it works because they are masters of their trade, it strikes me, because it is a masterpiece of cinema. Now, I don't know if I've answered the question there, but if you want to drop me a line, drop me an email, and we can carry on. I'm happy to keep discussing that one.
Okay, we've another question in. Again, I can't bring the questioner up. This is from Brian Matthews, and he says, how successful was the stage version of this Happy Breed, and how different was it from the excellent film version?
It's very successful. It's presented as part of a trilogy of I want to say new plays, kind of plays that he had on the stocks and was developing at the very end of the 30s, but the war had mucked up immediate productions of them. And of course, Coward plays Frank Gibbons in. He plays the role that Bobby Newton takes in the film. And when you look at the play script, and the film script, they are almost identical. There are very, very, very few changes to it. There's a couple of slightly longer soliloquies, which would have looked daft on the cinematic screen, work well on the stage, but wouldn't have done well in film. But they're really, really close. And it's interesting that so many of the reviewers of the film had seen it as a play, and they often comment how well it is translated. That it hasn't perhaps got the technical cinematic proficiency of In Which We Serve, being much more of a filmed play, but nonetheless, the techniques that are brought to it, the way it is done is very good, and retains the quality of the play.
Okay, we've actually got no further questions. One from me, though. The previous talks you've given to us, for instance, celluloid war memorials, the talk about the British instructional films was based on your book, Celluloid War Memorials, and you've done several talks on remembrance, various types of remembrance, be it Ypres, the Sacred Ground, or pilgrimages and tourists. And obviously that relates very much to your book, Postcards from the Western Front. I just wondered if tonight's talk is a book in progress, or...
It's certainly a piece of research in progress, yes, to be written up. Now, what length, what kind of length of statement it's going to be, I don't know at this moment. But I think, yes, kind of Coward and a few others as shall we say, middle class. Some might patronizing think of them as middle brow observers of the war is something that I really like to write about. And yeah, to juxtapose it as I did right at the start with authors like R.H. Mottram, to kind of triangulate against that. What are we seeing in this vision of the war? Because I think here in this happy read, to come back to the point that I laboured all the way through, I think we get that kind of miraculous thing of essentially a non-Great War veteran. He's only a veteran if you take it that for 3 months he was in khaki in a training camp on the home front. Managed to make such an essential statement about the mentality of servicemen and ex-servicemen as well. And I think that's what puts this happy raid and cavalcade up there with some of the crucial statements in British culture about the Great War from the 20s and 30s.
Just remains for me to thank Mark once again. Oh, we've got a question just come in. Hang on.
Right.
It's not a question. So from Lydia Manley, not a question, but that was wonderful, Mark.
Oh, that's very kind. Thank you. And as ever, that's really kind. And it is, I always appreciate the invitations. It's always such a great pleasure and privilege to speak to the WFA. And as I always say, very happy, to pick up on any points. The email address is m.l.connelly, CONNELLY @kent.ac.uk. Anything that you'd like to ask or pick up on, please feel free to give me a nudge. Very happy to have a little chat online or whatever way is best.
Excellent. I always enjoy your talks because they're not all blood and guts and different regiments. They're very different talk from our usual talks.
Well, that's great, and I think it's that wonderful thing, isn't it? The Great War was an all-consuming event, and as we know, as I say to my students, it was only, in inverted commas, only, and I stress again, inverted commas, fought for 4 years. We've been remembering it and chewing over in all sorts of different ways for over 100. The memory of it is bigger than the thing itself now. The way it's reflected upon is almost bigger than the thing itself, and that's what makes it so fascinating.
Excellent. Thanks again, Mark.
Pleasure.
Bye-bye now.
Good night. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Mademoiselle from Armentières, parlez-vous? Mademoiselle from Armentières, parlez-vous? Mademoiselle from Armentières, she hasn't been kissed for 40 years. Inky, pinky, parlez-vous? Out of kicking off.